Hello everyone, it's your Peacekeeper coming at you with a premium ship review of the Tier 6 French battleship Dunkerque. The Dunkerque class of battleships was a fast battleship class built for the French Navy in the mid-1930s, with the intention of countering the Deutschland class of heavy cruisers built by Germany that includes Graf Spee. The ship was laid down and weighed in at a svelte 26,500 tons, which was well under the agreed-to 1922 Washington Naval Treaty limit and the subsequent extension under the London Naval Treaty. The reason for this was to maintain a high speed, which they could use to chase down a fleeing cruiser to continue to engage it. And the Deutschlands coming in at 28.5-ish knots also meant that the higher top speed was an advantage to the Dunkerque class in chasing them down. The class was the first class of capital ships built by the French Navy after World War I. The unique gun configuration, which is both, well, it's all of the main battery forward and 2 quad turrets. The unique gun configuration is, as you'd expect, designed to allow the battleship to fire all 8 guns forward while presenting the smallest profile possible. This was seen as a tactical advantage for both charging into combat as well as pursuing a fleeing target. The quad turret arrangement was foreshadowed in the previous battleship design studies for the Lyon and Normandie class of battleships. The reasoning it was selected for Dunkirk was simple. To have the same offensive firepower facing forward, the amount of armor required to protect 3 super-firing 3-gun turrets, such as in the Nelson class, except for in the Nelsons you didn't have 3 super-firing turrets, you only had 2 that were capable. One that was capable of firing over the others, that was the number 2 turret. In order to match a profile where you had 2 turrets that could fire over the first turret and be able to fire all of your guns forward, you had to have a huge amount of armor to protect them, and it affected seakeeping because the height of the ship would have to be so tall to accommodate it. This was chosen as a compromise, if you will, to that design proposal, and this actually worked out better. You have the ability now to have 90% of the total firepower while actually having the capability of firing more guns forward. In the Nelson configuration, you would only be able to fire 6 guns. In Dunkirk's configuration and Richelieu's later, you were able to fire 8. The quad turrets were divided in half by an armored bulkhead, which was designed to keep a shell from disabling half of the offensive firepower of the ship should a shell strike the turret. This feature actually worked, and at Mers el Kabir, Dunkirk was struck by a 15-inch shell from Hood on the upper turret, which disabled the right half of the turret. An added downside to this arrangement was that the 2 barrels on each half of the turret shared a similar mounting block, and their proximity to each other meant that there was a significant problem with dispersion due to the blast from one barrel interfering with the adjacent barrel. And this wasn't actually corrected on any of the French battleships until after World War II, and in the case of the Richelieu and Jean Bart, it wouldn't be corrected until well after they had been repaired. Dunkerque and Strasbourg were never actually repaired. They were scrapped. As an interesting side note, the Dunkerque and Strasbourg never actually set sail with any high explosive or what would be called a common round. Although paperwork does exist that the shell type was proposed, none were actually produced, tested, or ordered. These ships also suffered from damage when firing the main guns due to the overall light construction of the ship. This was especially true for firing what would be considered over the shoulder, which is anything basically aside from 90 degrees to either side, so anything aiming slightly backwards over the shoulder. They would actually take damage when firing in this configuration. It would twist the hull and strained it to the point where it would cause some damage. As such, the firing arcs on Dunkerque and Strasbourg were limited not by the superstructure or possible damage to secondary or anti-aircraft mounts, but due to the the strain on the hull of the ship. So overall, not exactly the strongest of designs, but it definitely is a unique ship. In terms of service history, Dunkirk's life began in what can only be described as a purely French function. She represented the Marine Nationale, the French Navy, in 1937 at the British Naval Review. Later, she took part of another naval review near the Isle de Seine, which is a island just off the French coast in the northwestern part, that horn that sticks out into the Atlantic. That's where they were at, where she and the rest of the French Navy took part in combined exercises. She was then sent on touring the French colonies in the Atlantic Ocean, and after completing that tour, she joined the Atlantic Squadron to become the flagship of the French forces in the Atlantic. After a brief downtime for maintenance, Dunkirk joined a French task force created as a response to the Sudetenland crisis in Germany, which was Hitler's claiming control over ethnic Germans living in Czechoslovakia, which then prompted unrest. And then the nation eventually allowed the Sudetenland to secede into Germany and become part of Germany without Germany firing a single shot. Dunkirk returned to Brest in France, only to be sent to Lisbon, Portugal, to celebrate the discovery of Brazil and then on to Britain. The tour ended on the 21st of June, when the ship was ordered to return home. On September 2nd, 1939, the day after Germany invaded Poland, Dunkirk and the Force de Raid sortied from Brest to hunt down the Deutschland-class cruisers operating in the Atlantic. After 4 days, they returned to France, and Dunkirk was assigned to Force L with the aircraft carrier Bern and 3 cruisers. Their primary mission was to hunt down the Graf Spee. In November, Dunkirk joined up with the French 4th Cruiser Division and the HMS Hood to intercept the German battleships Scharnhorst and Gneisenau in the waters north of Great Britain. They were attempting to break out, the Scharnhorst and Gneisenau were attempting to break out into the Atlantic Ocean. She would be damaged on this sortie and was forced to return home. The damage was caused by bad weather damaging the bow of the ship. She would sortie again after repairs to Canada to deliver the Bank of France gold reserve to Canada, and then on her way back she covered a troop transport convoy. With hostilities increasing the Mediterranean, Dunkirk was ordered to the Mediterranean to protect French assets, but was quickly recalled due to the German invasion of Norway. To help cover both the Mediterranean and the Atlantic, Dunkirk and Strasbourg, with the majority of the French Navy, were stationed at Mers el Kabir in Algeria. They would sortie once more before the French surrendered to the Germans in June. Dunkirk's only combat would come not from the Germans, but from the British. On July 3, 1940, British Force H, centered around the HMS Hood, HMS Revenge, and HMS Valiant, arrived at Mers el Kabir to coerce the French Navy to either scuttle their ships in the harbor or join the British forces. This was done to prevent their capture by German forces. After negotiations broke down due to what the French described as a snub to their admiralty, caused by the Royal Navy sending a lower-ranking officer to negotiate with theirs, as well as a snub to their vows that they would scuttle their ships to prevent the Germans from capturing, the British opened fire on the ships to sink them to prevent their capture. Dunkirk was not facing the British forces in harbor and was unable to open fire, but her crew was able to get the ship unchained and out of her mooring spot before the shells came in. She would get hit by 4 shells from the HMS Hood, which killed the right half of her number 2 turret. The others penetrated the main armored belt, one of which penetrated into the central boiler rooms and caused severe damage. The last remaining shell hit the aircraft handling facilities on the aft of the ship and it only caused minor damage. However, due to the damage caused, Dunkirk was forced to beach to prevent her loss. Later, the French would boast that Dunkirk was only moderately damaged in the Algerian and French press, and the Royal Navy returned a few days later to finish her off. Due to the location of her beaching and the desire not to have civilian casualties, the Royal Navy sent torpedo bombers in to attack Dunkirk. One torpedo hit a patrol boat next to Dunkirk, which was loaded with depth charges, and caused massive damage to the hull of the ship. A second torpedo struck Dunkirk and forced the ship to settle in the shallow waters that she had beached in. After repairs, Dunkirk was refloated and sent to Toulon in France for repairs, but due to a lack of materials and personnel to work on the ship, repairs were slow. After the Allied invasion of North Africa, the Germans attempted to seize the French ships in Toulon. The French Navy scuttled the entire fleet, which included Dunkerque and Strasbourg. The ship would eventually be captured by Italian forces, which then began to scrap the ship. She was damaged further to prevent repairs should the French recapture the ship. Part of this was her main battery was cut off, just forward of about the 1/3 visible section, so about where the cursor is at on the screen. And other items on board the ship were damaged, things like the engines and the steering gears. Once the Italians surrendered, the Germans took control of the hulk. They refloated the ship, which was in a dry dock when it was scuttled. They floated it out of the dry dock to free up room for other ships. And while in the harbor, she was bombed several times by the Allies before finally being abandoned completely by the Germans. The remaining 15,000-ton hulk was finally scrapped in 1958. In-game, Dunkirk is a unique ship in that her all-gun forward configuration provides an excellent performance against enemy battleships, as she's able to maintain a bow-in profile while bringing her entire main battery to bear. Her main battery has good armor piercing and good high explosive, and I can't help but imagine that the high explosive is French sailors loading the barrels with baguettes and firing them due to no high explosive shell actually existing for these guns. Her anti-aircraft suite is adequate when fully spec'd into AA, but it's not overly strong otherwise, and her secondary battery is distinctly average as well. One added downside to her gun configuration is that her secondary battery is primarily in the rear of the ship, which limits their firing arcs tremendously, and makes them kind of really not all that useful unless you're constantly, showing the aft end of the ship to your enemies, which, by the way, is not a good way to go about, because you don't have much of ability to actually fire your main battery at things, because it's all in the front of the ship. She does not perform very well under heavy high explosives fire, which, as we all know, is quite common now. And, I guess it's always been common, but it's even more common now, due to the large superstructure and large area of the ship that really doesn't have much in the way of armor. But on the upside, the ship is one of the fastest Tier 6 battleships, and as such, she can move around the map with her great speed, and she can really maximize the total number of broadside targets in which she can engage because of that speed. When it comes to dealing with other battleships, she does fine, but it should be noted that her bow armor is sufficient enough only to handle 14-inch guns and below. She should not attempt to bow tank 15-inch or greater shells, as they will penetrate the bow armor easily. And the added downside is the outer hull plating on this ship is all 25mm, which means that the main armored belt is hidden by the torpedo bulges, and it makes it very difficult to actually angle this ship and not take some amount of damage, as it's quite easy for those 15-inch shells to overmatch the 25mm hull plating, and thus, at least get a normal pen, if you will. So let's look at some of the stats of Dunkirk. She has 52,600 hit points and up to 340mm of armor. Her torpedo damage reduction value is 27%, which is okay. It's better than nothing, and as far as battleships are concerned, it's on the low end, but really the ship's profile and ability to really only be bow into its most common threats, I really don't think that this is as big of a disadvantage as many would think. You have such a narrow profile when you're bow in all the time that it's hard for torpedoes to really be a big threat to them. The main battery consists of 2 quad turrets mounted with 330mm or 13.5-inch guns. That's if my math is correct. Let's double check that real quick. 13-inch guns. Straight up 13. There's no half there. So the main battery has a firing range of 18.2 kilometers, 227 meter dispersion, 31.6 second 180 degree turn time, which is excellent, 28 second reload time, which is, I guess it's better than the 30 second average, and at this tier I think most battleships are hovering in the 34 second range, it seems like. HE shell damage, 4,800 damage, so not a whole lot of HE shell damage, but 35% fire chance, which makes these very reliable at starting fires. I guess flaming baguettes work very, very well. AP shell damage maxes out at 9,700 damage, which is pretty good, but as an interesting side note, there is a difference in the shell velocity of both the high explosive and AP. The AP is slower. So not a whole lot slower, only 15 meters per second, but definitely something to keep in mind. The secondary battery consists primarily of 2 dual 130mm gun mounts and 3 quad 130mm gun mounts. And their firing range is 6.3 kilometers with advanced firing training on the captain. But that's about the extent of that. Anti-aircraft defense, she's got a smattering of anti-aircraft guns, but they don't seem to be too terribly effective. The bulk of her AA comes from these 130mm gun mounts, again, 3 quad, 2 dual. She also has 5 dual 37mm guns, as well as 8 quad 13.2mm guns, which looks surprisingly like a 25mm quad mount for the Japanese. Max speed of 31 knots with a speed flag. So let's pull that speed flag off. Should be 29, I think, without. 29 and a half. 730 meter turning radius, 14-second rudder shift time. However, that's going to be without the rudder shift module. Yes, you heard that right. Finally, a battleship without a rudder shift module. Detection range by sea is 14.1 kilometers, which at this tier is actually pretty bad. It's not quite Fuso bad, but it's getting pretty close. 10.3 kilometers by air, and 14.2 if you're firing it in smoke. Speaking of upgrade modules, let's look at those upgrade modules now. I am running Main Armaments Mod 1, and that will come as a surprise to many people. This is going to have a 20% reduction in the risk of your main battery becoming incapacitated. It's going to increase the hit point pool of the main battery by 50%, and it's going to decrease the time it takes to repair them by 20%. Many people are going to go, why? And the reasons are simple. Dunkerque's turrets seem to be extremely fragile for how much armor they have, and the only thing I can think of is that this relatively vertical front face at closer ranges is very susceptible to incoming AP fire. And unlike the real ship, Wargaming has chosen not to make it, or maybe there's a programming limitation that prevents them from making it so that if you incapacitate the turret, only half of it is lost. That is not the case in this game. So if you lose the turret, you literally lose half of your firepower. And that is a huge disadvantage to this ship at close range engagements. If you've got an enemy captain that is shooting at the turrets, you can lose the turret quite easily, which is why I'm running Main Armaments Mod 1. Of course, if you want to play the ship at longer ranges, which honestly I don't recommend, the ship is best played around 10 to 14 kilometers. I think that's personally where it plays best. You could always run Auxilary Armaments Mod 1 if you're less worried about your main battery getting taken out, but personally, I find it to be one of the biggest downsides to the ship. Auxiliary Armaments Mod 1 increases the secondary battery mount survivability by 100% and the anti-aircraft gun mount survivability by 100%, so you're doubling the hit point pool. In the second slot, I'm running Damage Control Systems Mod 1, which makes 3% reduction in the chance of flooding, as well as 3% reduction in the amount of torpedo damage, as well as a 5% reduction in the chance of being set on fire. In the third slot, well, I really don't recommend either of these two other options because as a battleship, you really don't lose your engines or rudders that often, and when you do, you can usually tank enough hits to have your damage control party come back up. In the third slot, I am running Aiming Systems Mod 1 for the 7% reduction in the dispersion of the main battery. Of course, this also adds 5% to the secondary battery firing range and decreases the secondary battery dispersion by 5%, but really I'm doing it for the 7% reduction in the main battery dispersion. Other options here, if you really want to play it as a secondary ship, there's Secondary Battery Mod 2 to add more range to your secondaries. 20% more range and 20% reduction in the dispersion of the secondaries. Personally, I don't find this very useful on this ship. There's not a lot of secondaries, and they are really poorly laid out in order to actually use them. In fact, you would have to be nearly broadside just to bring, basically half of them to bear. Be 10 barrels, and that would be about the extent of what you could bring unless you were fully aft on, which that crane is probably in the way and prevents that one's firing arcs. The only other option in this that I would consider is AA Guns Mod 2, which boosts the anti-aircraft firing range by 20%. In the fourth and final slot, I am running Propulsion Systems Mod 2, and many people are going to go, why? And the reason is simple. This ship's bow-in configuration, like the ability to stay bow-in 100% of the time, just really allows for this ship to be kind of a pest. And if you stay at the 10 to 14 kilometer range with Allied support, there's no reason to turn much from that configuration. And so as a result, being able to speed up and slow down within that -6 to 6 knot range really is a help. You wouldn't think it until you actually run the module yourself, but it really does help the ship evade fire coming in. And I quite like this module on it. Of course, Damage Control Systems Mod 2 would be a fantastic backup to that. And that's going to reduce the time it takes to recover from a flood or extinguish a fire by 15%. Both of which are actually very viable on this ship. Steering Gears Mod 2, I can also see a good case made for this if you play it like a traditional battleship and really want the ability to, point the bow at the most lethal threat and maybe even alternate between multiple targets if you wanted to. So any of these three are really viable. I've chosen Propulsions Mod 2 just so that I can be a little cheeky jerk and move back and forth and slow down much quicker once we get into that -6 to 6 knot range. Alright, that's enough of talking about the ship in port. Let's go look at it in a battle video. Alright, so I've played this ship a couple times on my stream, but here we are again playing it. The map is Neighbors. It is a Tier 7 fight, however there are no Tier 7 battleships in this fight. It's only, I think there's an Atlanta on the enemy team was the only one. And as it comes to no surprise to anyone, my preferred location to go on this map is these northern islands, which we've spawned on this side, which is fantastic. And really, the main benefit of being up here in the northern part is that we're able to use the bow forward configuration of the guns in combination with the islands to really attack the enemy without risk of exposing too much of the side of our ship. And that can be a bit of a hard game to play, and if you're not used to like the old USS Iowa or the North Carolina's play style, it can be a bit daunting at times to play that way because you really, I don't know, I get a little impatient and uncomfortable when I'm stationary or bow into a target too long because it limits your tactical options heavily, in my opinion. Basically, you're telecasting to the enemy team the only direction in which you are wanting to go. And, you can see here, even without the rudder shift module, the ship is still pretty maneuverable. And we start off by kind of going towards the south here, but you'll see we'll end up in those islands sooner rather than later. But gun firing arcs, obviously, with the bow forward configuration, all of the guns can be brought to bear straight forward. All of the guns can fire straight ahead. Even firing over the shoulder towards the rear of the ship, you can actually do pretty well. I mean, it may be a bit ahistorical, but wargaming has allowed us to fire pretty much, it's not quite straight aft, but you've got pretty good firing arcs all around on this ship. For the main battery. The secondary battery, well, as we already talked, it's kind of a joke. It really doesn't do a whole lot. So we've got enough ships up here that I think we could probably sneak it if we wanted to start heading up towards the north. But we're going to hang out towards the middle here, at least initially, until things kind of settle out a little bit. Now we're starting to make our turn in. And we have a Gremiashi on our team, but one other thing that has been interesting about the ship is the 13-inch main battery on board is actually really good at nuking destroyers and cruisers, and it does pretty good damage to broadside battleships, but I can't help but laugh at times when it comes to dealing with ships like this, Nicholas. The number of destroyers that have popped up and then suddenly eaten about 8,000 damage and over in normal pens has been just downright comical because, for one, they don't really expect it, but the low caliber and high velocity guns, if they present any bit of an angle and it penetrates, you're getting a lot of normal pens. So we finally take our first shot, and it's out on a Cleveland. You can see they're most likely not going to be landing any hits, but of course we're being engaged by something which starts us promptly on fire twice. So we quickly nuke that with our repair party, and now we can see we have a Nuremberg here that, the Germans, we need to go and kill him. It's like rage-inducing, like, oh my goodness, we must kill him, and we must kill him now. So, Cleveland, there is a Dunkirk over there as well. Well, here we go. We get to see the rearward firing arcs pretty good here. Of course, that Nuremberg, kind of expecting him to come out of the island, but you can see there's their Dunkirk. He's backing up, so we'll engage him. You can see that there in the lower left-hand screen, you can see there's a pretty good set of firing arcs there. And we take 5,700 damage off. 2 normal pens and an overpen equals 5,772 damage. Of course, that Dunkirk is on fire. And his name is Armored Makarov. Alright. So, alright. So we're gonna keep going through. And this ship really does well when it comes to punishing enemy cruisers is really a strong suit of it. Oh, well, Nuremberg, that's broadside. We're not detected. So this Nuremberg is stationary. Not my first choice. You can see you're aimed a little bit high, but, we lopped off 10,000 hit points in one salvo. So I'm not going to complain too loudly about that. Of course, we all know what the Nuremberg did, so we definitely want to turn in. And for those who don't know what he did, he launched torpedoes. Guaranteed he launched torpedoes as soon as he saw me. So we slam on the brakes, turn in a little bit there, and now we're kind of in a holding pattern waiting. And we're not detected by anything. That's because the Cleveland that's over there is behind an island. There's the torpedoes. And anytime you see a cruiser broadside, that's about the angle that they have to launch most of their torpedoes at. So if you see a cruiser that is broadside or making a turn to go broadside, you can pretty much guarantee that he is going to be launching torpedoes. So at this point, we're kind of hunting around for targets to engage. We got this Cleveland over here. There's a Dunkirk that we could engage. There's a Nicholas. Oh, hey, look, a Cleveland. Well, how about you, Mr. Cleveland? Howdy doody. And let's get on, 2 overpens for 2,000 damage. Yeah, not overly amazing with the dispersion. There's this Nicholas here that I definitely want to be careful of, because, it's a destroyer, and yeah, at these ranges, Nicholas torpedoes, which I think are 5.5 kilometers, they can do damage. So we're going to go ahead and we're going to go around this island. You can see I'm holding onto my fire until I see that he is going away. So now we're going to return and focus on this Cleveland, which is doing a surprisingly large amount of damage to me with his AP. But, 3 overpens for 3 grand. I hope this isn't forecasting for the future of the French Navy battleships in this game. Could be very hairy. And our Cleveland charges into the smoke to deal with the Nicholas and eats his torpedoes. And my guns aren't up in time to actually get him. So Okay, and how about we turn and focus on this Cleveland? One other thing that I have noticed is the high velocity of these guns. Yeah, there we go. How about 21,000 damage? The high velocity of these guns is very, very detrimental when it comes to aiming at ships. If you are used to ships like... Oh, we'll throw out... If you're used to ships like... you know, North Carolina or other U.S. battleships have a real big problem with basically overpenning things for days. So Major Ken has opted to focus fire me, which means it is time for me to focus fire him. Oh, wait. We've got a Cleveland, we've got a Dunkerque, we've got a Nicholas, all of which are hiding somewhere on this match, around this island, and we don't want to make too many telegraphed turns, but how about 13,111 damage, Mr. Ken? That's right, silence those guns, at least temporarily. Up to 55,000 damage, and using the speed and our throttle jockeyingness to... really throw him off, and he's trying to do the same. He's being cheeky. He's trying to slow down and get away from me here. How about no? And we get our first kill, and it is Major Ken. So now we've got a Cleveland that's coming out straight ahead, a Dunkirk, which is somewhere, and a Nicholas, which is also somewhere. And I am going about... 7 knots. There's the Nicholas. Oh boy. I'm pretty much dead, I'm saying to myself, so we're spamming the go-ahead. We're waiting for the guns to come around and the secondaries actually do some work and finish him off. But we know that his torpedoes are incoming, so we're going to continue going ahead. And this is a perfect example of where the speed boost, or not speed boost, but the engine upgrade works well. And a Cleveland that is presenting an angled profile, no problem. Down he goes. So now we've got him down, and we've got a set of 3 torpedoes coming in. Well, that can only be one thing. It has to be a destroyer of sorts, obviously, because it wasn't the Cleveland. And I only know of a handful of destroyers that have that configuration that are in this tier range. And I'm going to guess it's a Fubuki. And there the Fubuki pops up on the screen. He's damaging me with his guns and trying to get me to turn around, I'm assuming, but promptly ends up disappearing. Our AA does some work, and really thought maybe we would get a moment here with this Dunkirk here, but you can see engaging the rear of the Dunkirk, we end up doing about 8,500 damage. We're up to 67,657 damage now. Looks like there's going to be 1 torpedo and 2 torpedo. So now if we can get any fires on him, and this, you can see here, this is really the disadvantage of this ship when it comes to, you know, secondaries. My secondary battery, the only one that's capable of engaging right now, is that one that you saw that was just forward. Okay, so there was shots aimed a little too low, but still did about 6,000 damage. Now we're turning the other way. There's nothing to our broadside that we have to worry about for damage, so I don't have to worry about exposing a broadside. And here you can see this is an added disadvantage for, you know, Dunkirk engaging another battleship. And you can see here I've opted to force him to traverse his turrets, used that speed, used that advantage there to force him to traverse his guns. And we do another 8,500 damage. And now, so long as I expose nothing but my broadside, the chances of him doing enough damage to me is very low. And our secondaries are doing some work. We're up to 4,750 hits now, and down he goes due to fires started by the secondaries. So up to 85,795 damage. Now, a lot of people would be asking right about now, why don't you turn and charge towards the cap? Well, the vast majority of the reason for that at this point is because this Fubuki really doesn't have to do anything and can remain entirely invisible to me. There's no way I would be able to cap this with that Fubuki being there in time to actually, you know, in order to win this game. Unless that Fubuki somehow manages to expose herself and just really, really, really wants to die, there's just no way. And at this point, the game's basically lost anyway, so I'm going to try and make what I can of it by going and charging our cap. Maybe delay the game as long as possible. Maybe get lucky and get some more damage. Maybe another kill. Get that crack in. That would be nice. We're up to 4 kills. So we've managed to shoot down 3 aircraft, all of them spotting planes because there's no aircraft in here. But you can kind of see how Dunkirk's gun configuration allows it the ability to really charge ahead. And I personally really enjoy playing this ship. It has a lot of redeeming features that make the gameplay unique enough to where I'm okay with it. What was that? That was actually a pretty big shell hit there. That was not the Fubuki, so that must have been the Giulio Cesare, but the shells looked like they were coming from behind. Ah, there they are. Okay, so that is the Giulio. So we will have to deal with that, of course. We're at the added disadvantage of being perma-spotted by a Fubuki, which does not help any. I can also tell how far away that Fubuki is based upon where those torpedoes stopped pursuing, like where they ran out of steam. And 3 more torpedoes and they too ran out of steam. So that is definitely an added advantage. The Fubuki is far enough behind us that I think that we can deal with at least this Giulio Cesare. Maybe we'll get lucky with him, and, maybe we'll finish him off as well. So the Frisco Kid, as his name is, 8,300 damage, and not bad, really, but again, here we are taking damage. And in terms of, bow camping, there isn't a ship currently on the board that we could not kill based upon that we couldn't bow camp based upon our bow armor profile, which again is we have 14 inches of bow armor, or we have the capability of bouncing 14-inch shells with our bow armor with that 25mm plate. There's another salvo there. We are up to 102,837 damage. Really hoping to get really hoping to get that 5th kill, but at this point it's looking less and less likely. The absence of a heal is really hurting, and the Giulio, for whatever reason, is using HE, which I suppose is pretty good. But we're going to angle away in the hopes that maybe, just maybe, we can catch one broadside. He's angled away from us, and, well, yeah. Dispersion and all of that, plus the whole enemy team. And at this point, I can't continue this turn because there's an island here. So we're just praying that we can get just a little bit more damage in and finish off maybe the Giulio Cesare, but I really don't think that's going to happen. Maybe we can get lucky and finish, do a fairly substantial chunk of damage to Congo. So our last 2 salvos there, and yeah. Well, it wasn't the world's best game, but it shows a lot of the strengths and weaknesses of the ship, mostly in the secondary battery. Still finished with 112,000 damage, 1,007 base XP, which would have probably been about 1,700 had we won. There's the credits and XP screen. Overall, I do really enjoy this ship a lot. It has a unique play style, and I find it to be quite a lot of fun. So if you happen to see it in the shop, pick it up. Anyway, I'm your Peacekeeper. Like, comment, subscribe, and thank you for watching.